What's going on, everybody? Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and whatever time it is, and welcome back to another video with you, man, Measureholic. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my campaign overview series for Divide et Impera for Total War Rome 2. Today, we are looking at the Seleucids. Now, before we jump into it, I'll just let you guys have a little brief rundown on how this video is going to work. Part 1, we will be looking at the campaign overview. That is the strategy, the diplomatic level, and the economics of the Seleucids on the grand campaign. Keep in mind, these faction overviews are designed just for the grand campaign, not for any DLC. I won't keep reiterating that. That would probably be the last time, but just to let you know, grand campaign only. Moving forward, part 2 will be about the military of the Seleucids, their strengths, their weaknesses, any tips that I can offer you, and general strategy that surrounds their armies, and what you'll be mainly relying on, or at least from a typical standpoint. This is Total War, you can do whatever you want at the end of the day. And then part 3 will be the verdict. There'll be some general tips, tricks, some final summaries about the Seleucids, in addition to me giving them an official difficulty level. Now, this is going to be a very interesting one, playing as the Seleucids. There's a lot of mixed opinions on this faction, I feel personally, so I'm looking forward to giving you guys my final verdict, and I'm really curious to see what you all have to say down below. But in the meantime, let's jump right into it. To get us started, I'm going to very quickly cover their benefits. They're not like Carthage in that they don't have a bunch of families to choose from. So we thankfully don't have to go through all of that. Instead, I'm just going to list very quickly. They have Alexander's legacy, so they have a 20% resistance to foreign occupation, well, minus 20%. So generally that should help you take over new lands with a little bit less resistance to your occupation. So that should, in theory, come in handy, although we'll see just how much when we get into the campaign. And then you have plus 10% morale for all of your units when you're fighting against other Hellenic factions. Anyway, let's get on down to the specific benefits and negatives that the Seleucids suffer. So up here, these two benefits, they apply to all of these factions. However, these 3 down here apply only to the Seleucids, just to make it clear to you. They have the Royal Estates trait, which increases agricultural income. That's going to be really, really helpful, actually. I'm not sure on the exact percentage. I wish it was displayed. But the bottom line is that basically you earn more income from the agriculture or the farms that your faction has, which is really helpful because trade is not going to be a strong point for the Seleucids, at least not early on. And we'll get into why very soon. They have the multiculturalism perk, decreased foreign culture public order penalties. That just helps your first perk up here even more. To, in theory, again, just in theory, decrease the public order that your provinces and cities will be suffering due to your occupation of those said cities and provinces. However, you have a Overlords of the East perk where you have a major diplomatic penalty with all Persian factions. Keep in mind that is all Persian factions. Just looking briefly here on the map, the majority of these factions here are Persian, as are some above you. I'll show you some of them in game, but keep that in mind. It is specific to Persian, doesn't include Greek, doesn't include the Arab nomadic factions. It is very specific to Persian. I'll show you why that's important once we get in, which we are now going to. Let's hop into part 1 of the campaign overview, ladies and gentlemen. Let's do it. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, here we are on the campaign map. Now let's quickly jump into the strategic overview. As you can see, all of these light blue areas are yours. The Seleucids start off with one of the largest areas in the game at the start. They rival Carthage and possibly Egypt as well. Yeah, I would say Egypt as well. They have quite a few provinces and cities available to them. However, looking at our diplomatic status, we also have quite a few blue areas. These indicate allies, or in this case, these are all of your client states or your satrapies, to be a little bit more specific. All of these units here in the east and all of these in the west. They are your satrapies, so that basically they pay tribute to you. They cannot have their own diplomatic relations for the most part. I believe there's one that they can have. But for the most part, you control them, just not all that directly. They will join you in your wars, and they will give you a decent income to begin, which I'll show you guys and get into a little bit more depth shortly. So, the thing about these satrapies is that they will betray you. Usually, within the first 20 to 30 turns, you will have an event that will fire that will say, the satrapies that are sick of Seleucid overrule or overlordship, and they want to rebel. However, it is not necessarily guaranteed, and one way to beat this, or to stop it from happening at all, is to make them not hate you. Because looking at our diplomacy right here, the amount of red faces we are seeing on the right hand side of the screen is pretty insane. We have 5, 6 nations out of all of these nations that don't outright hate you. 2, 3, 4 of them are on neutral terms with you, and that they have the yellow face. And then there's 2 that are actually fairly friendly. Lydia over here is very friendly with you. They like you quite a lot, and as long as you don't do anything stupid, you don't trespass in their land, you don't declare on someone they like, declare war on someone they like, these are by far the most loyal of the satrapies in my opinion. However, it's not always guaranteed. The basic premise with the Seleucids is that you have a lot of satrapies out here, and at this point in history, these satrapies are getting sick of the Seleucids being the top dog, and eventually they're all going to rebel at once. So how you try to keep these people friendly is up to you. One of the easiest ways you can do it, though, is by declaring war on people that they don't like. For example, they might not like this faction down here, the Mauryans. They are Hindu, or basically Indian, coming from the east, so they would look at them as invaders for the most part. We'll see how the diplomacy pans out in your campaigns. They might not necessarily go to war with them, but it is quite likely, because all of these factions down here in the southern part especially are Persian, and that's why you're going to have to deal with that major diplomatic penalty. Even this faction up here, there are Parthians and Prafathas. They are Parni, so you don't have that diplomatic penalty against them. However, they still will want to rebel against you unless you convince them to like you. This faction here, they are not a satrapy of yours, so keep that in mind, and they are also Persian, so you'll probably end up fighting them eventually. Which brings me to my next point. The Seleucids are in a prime spot to be ganged up on from multiple areas. You have Egypt down here in the southwest that is going to declare war on you very, very early on, usually within the first 5 turns. I gotta slow down. Nabatea, if they don't join them, they will still declare war on you on their own, most likely. The Kidri over here, they can declare war on you, but they are a fairly minor faction despite them owning all of this land. It's pretty much just desert with one little town. So don't worry too much about them, but the Nabateans are not to be underestimated. They have only a small amount of land, but they have very good units that are going to be good in defeating your heavily armored units. They have a lot of axemen. Meanwhile, up here in the north, you have the Galatians. You also have this faction here that is no way I'm going to pronounce that. Cat Patuka, perhaps? The cats up here with a what looks kind of like a cat right there, just chilling. Anyway, they're not going to like you at all. They are also Persian. They have the diplomatic penalty against you. In addition, you also have Hake, or I believe you pronounce it Hike, perhaps? But either way, this is Armenia. Armenia is quite a powerful faction at this point in history. They have a lot of territory up here, and they only have small neighbors up here to the northwest and the southeast. So they can expand fairly quickly if the AI plays their cards right. And they also have some good resources, by the way, to bring me to another point shortly. Basically, you have almost no friends. You have Lydia over here, and Lydia will help you militarily, but they'll really only help you out here in the west. It's going to take them a long time to march your armies down here to help you against Egypt. And if your satrapies in the east rebel, you're going to have a floodgate of armies coming into your eastern territories, which is basically going to ruin you because of another major reason. Let's go to your trade and finance. Your income isn't all that bad. You have 4,000 per turn. However, you get 4,258 income from your satrapies. Although actually you do get 1,500 just from a base income. So if you lost all of your satrapies instantly though, you would be making barely just over 1,000 per turn, I should say. Barely over 1,000, and that is with the tiny little armies that you have at the start down here in Seleucia, or I believe that's where Ctesiphon should be, is it not? And yeah, I believe the Seleucid renamed the city, but don't quote me on that. Anyway, you have a tiny army down here. Over here at Antioch, you also have a very small army, although you do have some Silver Shield pikemen. And then you have a tiny navy. So think about that. Within the first 20 turns, you're going to lose over 90% of your income, and you don't even have an army in the field to try and not lose that income. So I think you can see the point here. The Seleucids are very much on their own, and they're really going to be relying on very skilled generalship to keep themselves going. It will also take a skilled diplomat to try and not get attacked from every angle. For example, you could pay off the Armenians to be friendly initially, and in the meantime, you could come down here and focus on the Nabateans and the Egyptians, try to knock them out quickly, or at the very least take up to Jerusalem, use Jerusalem as a buffer, or as a gateway to stop the Egyptians coming up to you. That's a possibility. However, the Egyptians also have territory up here in your northwest, and they often get Ephesus very, very quickly in campaigns. So be careful with that. They also have Salamis right here, literally like a quarter of a turn's journey away from Antioch. So they could attack your capital at any time, so you have to be wary of that. You do have a decent garrison, but their navies are very large and powerful. Combining one of their navies with an army, I don't know if you could hold Antioch with what you start off with. So keep that in mind. You're surrounded by enemies. You have the opportunity to use your diplomacy wisely. However, you're going to have to pour a lot of money into it, and you don't have a very good income, especially if your satrapies rebel, which you have to go in assuming they will. You can't rely on other nations in this game at all. Diplomacy, for the most part, is pretty broken, especially if you're playing on hard difficulty or above. I always recommend playing on normal until you really just want to go ahead and fight everyone and have one of those total war campaigns. But just keep that in mind. Your major players are going to be Armenia to the north, Egypt to the south, and then the Galatians can be a major player, but to be honest, that's kind of rare in the campaigns. In the latest DEI updates, I haven't really seen them grow all that much. But Armenia and Egypt will be your initial big problems to deal with, although Armenia can usually be bought off, I should say. So deal with that very quickly. Try to appease all of your satrapies in the east. You don't need them flooding in down here into your smaller cities, which aren't even all that great when it comes to making money. So all of your cities require a lot of development at the game start. You're not in a great position. You're really not. You do have a lot of cities though, and they do have good population. They almost all have over 30,000. Here at Hatra, they do not. Nor does Jura, but those two shouldn't, since they're very small towns along your vast kingdom. Charax here almost has 30,000. That's pretty impressive. So you're going to have a large manpower pool to draw from. So that's going to be very helpful for you, especially considering you're going to be probably fighting on multiple fronts at the same time, if not very shortly in quick succession. But looking at these towns, it leads me to another point. Trade is almost going to be non-existent for you in the early game. Mid to late game, sure, you can make it work. However, early on, you don't really have all that many resources. You have some silk here at Edessa, glassware down at Jura, and then you have grain down here at Charax. That's pretty much it. Well, that literally is it. You do have some resources nearby, for example, iron up here at Mazaca, more glassware at Salamis, Tyros has incense, so you have potential. For example, wine up here in the north, you have potential to get resources, but like I said initially, almost everyone hates you, and even then you only have the one port city here in the west at Antioch, and the factions that you can have diplomatic relations with don't like you. So in the early game, the only way to get around it is by wasting your one spy that you get and sending them on a long run over here towards Italy or even down to Carthage, heading out to Hispania, which I really don't agree with. I think that's really cheesy. It's a boring way to get trade with factions that are across the map that you historically shouldn't really be trading with, at least not directly. Obviously, indirectly, people trade with other factions across the entire world almost. But yeah, I really wouldn't recommend choosing it. But since you have just the one port city and all of the factions that are close to you hate you, you're not really going to have much trade at all. So you're really going to have to rely on building up your cities quickly, trying to use that agricultural bonus that you get, that I said at the start of this video you receive. Try to focus on that, and try to focus on looting prime targets. If you take a city that is in a province that you don't care about, loot it. For example, Mazaga, excellent opportunity for looting. It's a one city nation, and it's up here in a province where you don't have any cities, so you don't have to worry about diplomatic penalties. You can go up there, loot them very quickly, maybe let it rebel, take it over again, make it a client state. But in the process, you get yourself over 10 grand at least. I'm pretty sure 12 is the usual minimum for cities, maybe 13 grand. That's quite helpful. That can help you buy off Armenia very quickly. In the meantime, you can also spend your funds on developing your cities. Over here, taking on Atrapakan, you might want to consider looting some of their cities, although you will have to suffer a lot of diplomatic, or not diplomatic, I should say public order stress to deal with that. Just remember, if you loot a city, you got to suffer the consequences. It's not necessarily clear cut to loot anymore. However, that brings us to the end of part 1 for this video. The campaign overview is complete. You start off in a very rough position, but I'll go over it at the very end when we do the part 3 verdict. So anyway, now we're on to part 2. We are talking about the Seleucid military. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to part 2 of the video where we evaluate the Seleucid military. Now, if one word could describe this military, it would be Thaidoki, or perhaps even Alexander. That's right, this is a proper Alexandrian roster right here. You have a lot of pikemen, a lot of cavalry available, and that's basically all you need, or is it? Let's start by going from the top. The Seleucids have some pretty good friggin' general bodyguard units, especially in the late game. Their royal cavalry is pretty insane. They have excellent charge, very good melee attack. However, their defense is not all that great, so you probably want to charge them in and get them out very quickly. And that's pretty much the same for all of their bodyguard units at the start. They do have some excellent royal guard spear units, and their shield bearers are definitely nothing to scoff at, although their melee attack is a little bit low. For example, I believe a Spartan hoplite unit could go to toe to toe with this general's bodyguard, so you want to be careful with that. But anyway, they have very Hellenic style bodyguard units, and they're very excellent for the most part. But there is no swordsman, it is just shock cavalry and then some spearmen. And one of which is a hoplite unit, which means it's very slow, although the other one is actually really good. Probably one of, if not the best spearman unit in the game. Well, I wouldn't say the, but is one of the best spear units in the game, mainly due to their heavy armor, excellent all-around stats, and their fast nimble speed. Relatively fast considering how heavily armored they are. But anyway, going down, melee infantry, they have a decent selection here. One thing to keep in mind about the Seleucids though is that you can't just rely on this roster we're seeing here, because they are a large empire, or at least they will be a very large empire very quickly. So you have some AOR units that you can recruit from, that is area of recruitment units, which basically means once you take over a specific area, then you'll be able to recruit some of the units from there. Now they're not like Rome, you can't recruit a crap ton of them, but you can recruit some. For example, if you take over northern Syria, you can get some excellent Syrian heavy archers. And so you're going to be mainly relying on either these allied swordsmen in the early game, or recruiting mercenaries to supplement your swordsman roster. Besides that, you just have some levies, and then beyond that, you jump straight up into elites. These Galatians very much a mid to late game unit that you'll be relying on. But they're quite expensive and they're going to be hard to maintain as a frontline unit. These are going to be basically elite flanking units that you're going to rely on to kill the enemy from behind, but they won't be holding the line for you. You are not a sword faction. Even in the late game, I mean, you would really have to go out of your way to make an army of the Seleucids sword based. Although they do have some excellent elites, some very fantastic elites even. They could easily go toe to toe with the majority of Rome's legionaries. However, that is just the elites. They're expensive, they're hard to come by. You can't rely on them to win you battles consistently, especially once you take casualties that could take a while to replenish. As I said before, we have some of the best spear units in the game here, or one of, I should say, because you only have 2 spear units really. You have the Furio spears that are actually quite decent. They do have a javelin that they can throw in as well, as do most units in the game at the moment, although not all. And then you have the Seleucid Royal Guard, fantastic spear unit, heavily armored, well skilled, good morale, fairly fast considering how heavily armored they are. You get this unit into a cavalry unit, they'll wipe them out very easily. Fantastic spear unit, and they do have some bonuses such as a disciplined formation. They do have the square tactic that they can use as well to even further enhance them against enemy cavalry, which you will need if you end up fighting Persians, which you almost certainly will. However, moving down, we get to the bread and butter of the Seleucids, and that is pikes. Pikes and hoplites. They do have some hoplites here, although pikemen is really where you're going to want to be. Hoplites at this point are a dying type of unit. And what I mean by that is that they are now old. This is a time in history where the hoplite is no longer the dominant unit on the battlefield. What was just the dominant unit and still kind of is the pike. The pikemen, I should say. And then in the following years after that, it's the legionnaire that takes over when Rome ends up ruling the majority of the known world. But anyway, right now pikemen are where it's at, and that's where you're going to be trying to use them as much as possible. You do have the Greek bronze shield pikemen. They're your best low tier pikemen. However, despite them having decent armor, their shield is actually quite small, and so they're going to suffer to skirmishes if they are not well protected. And that goes for the same for the majority of your pikemen. Pretty much all of them, in fact. Even your silver shield pikemen don't have all that great armor, although they are excellent in killing and defending themselves. They are fantastic. Easily, in my opinion, the best pikeman unit in the game. I'm not sure you could find any other pikeman unit that would go up against them and come out favorable whatsoever. So anyway, let's move on to the missile infantry. Okay, so in the missile department, we actually have some options. We have some allied Greek archers and Greek javelin men here that are going to be basic, very cheap supplement to a lot of your armies. There are some Greek slingers that you can recruit, and like I said before, there are some AOR units that you'll be able to recruit to supplement some of these basic units. For example, if you take Jerusalem, you can, instead of getting Greek slingers, you can get Judean slingers that'll actually be better than Greek slingers. So this roster is perhaps not a true reflection of what the Seleucids get in the campaign, but it does give you a general idea of where you're going to be struggling and where you're going to be doing very good. Peltas are actually fairly good, although they don't have the as many good options as some of the other Diadochi factions. Even the Spartans get better Peltas from what I'm seeing. But again, the campaign is very different to a custom battle. Well, perhaps not very different, but fairly different. So you have some decent missile options. You apparently have Cretan archers available to you. However, I know in the campaign you have to actually get closer to Crete in order to recruit them. One of the best archer units in the game, probably first or second position in the entire game archer-wise. However, they do have a competitor in the Syrian heavy archers that you can recruit very easily from Palmyra, so I wouldn't really worry about trying to get Cretan archers when Syrian archers are almost just as good, if not better, due to the heavily armored nature. They're fantastic archers. I love using the Syrians. Try to use them as much as you can. But for the most part, the Seleucid missile department is fairly good, but not great. You're going to rely again on recruiting auxiliary units and mercenaries. Otherwise, you'll be just filling in the slots with very basic bare bones skirmishes, but you at least have them. Not all factions do. So be grateful, I guess. But anyway, moving on to their cavalry. Whoo, their cavalry. Very, very close to being the best cavalry in the entire game, especially in the shock cavalry department. Their melee cavalry is pretty good, if not great, for the majority. Especially these Seleucid citizen cavalry, they're friggin' awesome. The Greek companions, they're more so a shock unit that you'll charge into the enemy. If you can afford it and get them, Hellenic cataphracts, they will dead almost any line they go up against, except against pikemen, obviously. But they are very incredible, but they are very, very expensive. Insanely expensive, and they come from the very elite class of Seleucid society, so you're not going to have them in droves. Instead, you're going to be relying on units like this. This is also a fairly elite unit, but this is the Lycian unit. You're going to be relying on units that are AOR units as well for this. I mean, you have great cavalry, don't get me wrong. You won't necessarily have to rely on auxiliary units, but there are some available to you that are cheap and that are fairly lightly armored, and they do the job. For example, Cappadocian Lancers are very good shock cavalry for the early game, and you can recruit them in like half your territory at the start. So you basically won't need any of these units to begin with. They'll help you out, and you'll win against other shock cavalry when you go up against them. But despite you having all of these great options, you also have cheap options available to you that will do the same job. Definitely, they won't do it better, but they will do the same job. They'll do the bare minimum in giving you good rear charges and good kills from those charges. So don't necessarily just instantly charge into getting these heavy, expensive cavalry units. It's not necessarily always worth spending so much money when, for example, you might be able to afford 3 units of light shock cavalry for 1 extremely heavy unit. Just make sure you weigh up your options first. Okay, so now we're getting towards the end of their roster. We're now dealing with their skirmisher cavalry. They have Thurios cavalry, which is going to be the majority of your skirmisher cavalry that you'll be using. They're fairly basic. They don't necessarily have the greatest amount of ammunition, so that kind of sucks, but then all of your skirmisher cav have the same ammo. I use these in my campaigns quite often, and I find them to use their ammo very quickly. So you're going to want them to be very specific in what they're targeting. So perhaps take them off fire at will in your battles and try to use them sparingly. You do have Greek javelin cavalry, which are very light though. They will die quite quickly. You can use them to rear charge enemy light soldiers in the rear to get morale penalties. But beyond that, I mean, you may as well upgrade to get the Thurios cavalry fairly quickly. They have some decent armor, and they'll do better against other cavalry when they get caught in an inevitable melee. Tarentine cavalry, pretty friggin' excellent. However, even if you can recruit them, I wouldn't necessarily spend the extra money for them. They're not better in every single way when compared to the Thurios. For example, Thurios have better defense. Yeah, it's not flat out that they're better. The Tarentine Cav are excellent, don't get me wrong, but I mean, you could just get Thurios cavalry that are going to do the same job, especially once you train them up and get them veteranized. Okay, and then moving on to chariots, you do have the Scythe chariot available to you. Again, I'm not going to say a lot about these because I don't know all that much about chariots other than I don't use them. I don't recommend you do. However, they can have a decent impact on the morale of your enemies, but I mean, so can elephants. And the Seleucids are probably one of the #1 factions for elephants. In fact, I would say they are the #1 faction because they have Syrian mercenary elephants. The best elephants in the game, flat out. You can get Indian armored elephants. They're not as well armored, they don't have as good morale, and they don't have as good missile damage. Syrian mercenary elephants, as far as I'm aware, are the best elephants in the game. Perhaps the Indian faction gets really elite units. In fact, let's check very quickly, because I really got to notice now, and it will also help you out in your armor of 12. No, it looks like it's almost the same. And that's the Royal Bodyguard elephants. Wow, yeah, no. So I would, yeah, they do have slightly better morale. It would be super close between these elephants and the Syrians. And in fact, I would just give it to the Syrians. Yeah, they have almost the exact same stats and morale of what, 3 is the difference? Yeah, 3 is the difference in morale, so who cares about that? That's almost entirely negligent, doesn't matter. And these are available right next to your capital, and in fact you can get them just by upgrading your town centers, I believe so. Syrian mercenary elephants will win you many battles. Use them as much as you can. However, an armor of 12 is pretty pathetic. They will die to skirmisher fire. Be careful how you use them. Whether you're going up against players or AI, they will get targeted, and if they start to go crazy, then that's really going to hamper your attack or defense. So be very careful with them, but you don't have to necessarily be as careful as if you were at Carthage using your little baby elephants you get as Carthage. You also do have Indian elephants and Indian armored elephants, which are cheaper. I would use Indian elephants, but I wouldn't bother with these. If you're going to upgrade, just go all the way to Syrian. You may as well, right? But anyway, then they have the standard siege equipment options, some ballista, and some scorpions. So just keep in mind what I've said for almost every single class of troops here, in that you will have a lot of AOR units available to you, and they'll be coming from different cultures, different nations, and so because of that, it means that they'll be drawing from different populations in your society, which will really help you keep your armies filled with manpower, as that is actually a pretty big issue that can happen early on if you throw away your armies very quickly. So be careful with that, but generally summarized, Seleucids have the best pikes in the game, excellent cavalry, they have some good auxiliary and mercenary options for the most part. Skirmishers and archers are pretty good, however, they're not going to win you every single engagement. For example, they will get defeated by Rhodian slingers very easily, and the Rhodians will often end up going to war with you, so be careful in your skirmishing department. But beyond that, the only other real area you go lacking is in swordsmen. So let's move forward anyway to look at the navy very quickly. I'm not going to focus very much on the navies at all in these faction overviews. Basically, the Seleucids rely heavily on their melee ships, and that is mainly to ram the enemy. You can see here they have a lot of variety in melee ships, but beyond that they only have a few skirmishing units available to them, and it's not like there could be much more. I mean, a ship is a ship, you know, the only real difference is the strength of the boat itself and then the amount of troops on it. So when you're playing as the Seleucids and you're doing some naval battles, you're going to be mainly relying on your melee ships, so it is slightly different to, say, a faction like Carthage, which does have better archers, so keep that in mind. If you are taken to the seas, focus on your melee units, rush in, hit the enemy ships, rush out, or board them and see what you can do, although unless they're Roman ships, do not board Roman ships. I can highly recommend against that. Anyway, let's move on to part 3 with our verdict of the Seleucids. Okay guys, so this is going to be a pretty quick part 3 verdict. I'm going to cover some points very quickly and then we'll get into a little bit more in depth at the end. But firstly, this is going to be a very heavy battle dependent faction, in that your faction will be relying on you to win battles and win battles almost constantly to just stay alive, to be honest. You're going to be required to be a good general of every single army. You have to fight all of your early battles, I should say, in manual mode. It'd be pretty rare to do an auto resolve. I wouldn't auto resolve unless it was like 96+% of your army will be remaining. You're gonna be really required to do some good micromanagement in those battles as well. You're gonna have to cycling your elephants and your cavalry while you're trying to not let your skirmishers die, and you're gonna have to try and control your pikemen to push the enemy and hold against the enemy when appropriate. which is not easy, especially in DEI, where you need to give your pikemen and hoplites repeated orders. So do be wary of that. You gotta be on the ball with your micromanagement. Furthermore, skillful diplomacy can help you out there, though. You might not necessarily be fighting on every single side of your borders, but it can happen very, very easily. So if you're proactive and you get some friends and you get some factions not hating you, then you should be doing fairly well for the most part. You will still have some big enemies to deal with. For example, Egypt is a no-brainer. You're going to have to fight them almost no matter what. So do it. But just do your diplomacy well. Think about what factions you don't want to fight, and then try to get friendly relations with your satrapies without spending too much money. You're going to need money to develop your cities and your armies, so try to declare war on people that they don't like, or just get as many treaties as you can with them. Do anything you can to make them like you more, basically. Moving forward though, this is basically the ultimate Hellenic experience, so that's something to keep in mind when you're choosing what faction to play next. You're in the center of Alexander the Great's old empire, right? That means you're going to be fighting a lot of different cultures. You're going to be fighting Egyptians, Persians, desert nomads, Greeks. Eventually you'll be also fighting Gauls and Romans in the west. Gauls are even right above you, so you'll be fighting them. You also have nomadic factions to your north, so you're going to get a lot of variety in this campaign, which will make it a lot of fun, but it'll also make it very challenging, especially considering you are a very Hellenic style faction, which means that you don't have a lot of diversity in your army, or at least you don't have a lot of flexibility, at least not in the early game. In the later game, once you have more AOR units available, then you can be a little bit more flamboyant with your armies and create more swordsman based armies or more mobile cav armies, things like that. But initially you're going to be fighting in a very Hellenized style, so keep that in mind. However, in the late game, you're going to really struggle against Rome. You're going to be really relying on your elephants to do the damage against them. This is a very similar situation to Carthage. On a naval scale, you should beat them if you can afford to have enough navies to fight them. However, the Romans do have a decent navy, and they do have very good melee troops on their navies in the mid to late game. So by the time you're fighting Rome, they're going to have some of their best troops coming your way. That's going to be a major fight on your hands, and you can't rush them, they're too far away. So if you're playing a long-term campaign, good luck with Rome. My advice is to try and use your pikes to hold their troops in formation, and then just obliterate their units with your elephants and your cavalry. You're really going to need some heavy shot cavalry to deal with that, but again, light cavalry can still do some of the job that heavy shot cavalry can. Just depends on the armies you're going up against. Okay, getting down to our final couple points. In the early game, strike the factions that you know you're going to go to war with as quickly as possible. I would recommend starting in the north first. You don't want to fight Armenia, but you can fight the smaller factions next to it, such as the Galatians and the Persians above you. Knock them out of the game as quickly as you can, either by making them a satrapy, or just liberating them and creating basically a new military ally for you, or you could just occupy them and solidify that territory above you for yourself. But I would certainly focus on the smaller factions initially. Maybe even instead of fighting Egypt, you should fight the Arabs below you first and then worry about fighting Egypt, because a lot of the Arabs are going to fight you regardless. So take out those smaller factions early on, because otherwise you're going to have major factions like Egypt throwing their armies at you. Meanwhile, these smaller factions are still going to be able to field at least 2 full stack armies, if not more. And it's going to be really surprising. It's going to catch you off guard that such small nations could field so many armies. So do be careful with that. I really recommend focusing on the smaller nations at the beginning of the game. Now moving on to my final point, the difficulty level. Now this is a tricky one. To be honest, it kind of depends on what submods you use with your campaigns. This is going in based off people playing purely just with Divide and Impera, not any of the Greek submods that are available to alter what happens in the Middle Eastern theater during this time, although there are some very excellent submods that I recommend you check out on the Total War Center. However, my difficulty level rating is going to be a 5 out of 10. It might be a little bit higher compared to what some people think. I know quite a few people think that the Seleucids are fairly easy. However, I feel like they're not really. I mean, even in the early game, if you don't have your satrapies rebel, which you can avoid fairly easily, at least you can have most of them not rebel, you still have a lot of enemies around you, and while you will win against them, for example Armenia and the Egyptians, you will almost certainly win your wars against them, but by the time you're done with them, Rome has already carved up most of Greece and Carthage, and is just playing around with Hispania and Gaul, and then you're going to have to butt heads with them eventually, especially if you're going for a massive military victory in the long endgame campaign. I don't really care about objectives, but I know some people do. You're going to be spending a lot of your time and resources fighting off these factions, and then you have to keep in mind in the far east you have Bactria, which is a faction that, while they might not necessarily be too tough to deal with since they're fairly small and they might not even expand all that much, they are very far away from you, but you have to deal with them. You can't ignore them. It's just like the Mauryaans in the southeast, in southeastern Persia. You have to deal with them. You can't ignore them. You could try to buy their friendship for both factions possibly, but even then it's just unlikely it's going to stick for very long, and so you're going to have to basically do a lot of cleaning up of the area before you can worry about fighting the Romans in the west. And the Romans, as we'll probably talk about for most of these faction overviews, will be your enemies in the late game. It's pretty unlikely there'll be any other faction that will take over. Maybe Carthage will, if you're lucky and Carthage beats Rome. You'll beat Carthage any day of the week. That shouldn't be a problem. Your armies are pretty freaking good. Alexander the Great conquered all this territory with these units at your disposal. But times are changing. Units are starting to become more agile, more faster, more swordsman based, more killing based, rather than just pikemen and defensive based. So you do have very good quality units at the start of the campaign, but basically the longer the campaign goes on, the more difficult it will be for you to deal with the other factions that are at your level. For example, Bactria and Egypt will also get the same reforms that you will, so you're going to be dealing with them getting better units as well. However, in the early game, I'd argue that the Seleucids have better troops than Egypt. I can't say about Bactria yet, as I don't know enough about Bactria, but they definitely outclass Egypt in my opinion, and they have more AOR units available that they can use to come in and quickly ruffle stomp a lot of the Egyptian provinces with very little drawback if you play your cards right. So I'm going to give this a 5 out of 10. Might be a little bit higher than what some of you guys would be expecting, but we just have so many things to balance, and your late game is going to be hard almost regardless of how well you balance your early game. There's very little you can do on it except hope for the RNG gods to be in your favor, and you don't have to fight Rome in the end, but you almost always will, especially in the recent changes, which, to be honest, I think is a good thing because it gives you a really fun late game challenge. And if you can beat it, kudos to you. I would love to see you or hear about your stories on beating Rome and winning your campaigns as the Seleucids. So let me know your thoughts down below. Hopefully this video and my other faction overviews will help you figure out what factions you want to play in Divide and Impera. The #1 mod for Rome 2 in my opinion. I can't play Rome 2 without it. So I highly recommend you guys hop in and give the Seleucids a try though. They're a very interesting faction with a lot of problems to deal with, and they are very dynamic in how they can deal with those problems. So I really hope you guys enjoy playing with them as I have. I've been doing some testing with them obviously to give you guys accurate information, or at least an accurate opinion. So anyway, thank you all for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I shall see you in the next one.